Sparks showered onto scorched decking as the crippled cruiser tore through the upper atmosphere, leaking heavy radiation into the void. Desperation drove a shattered crew toward a pale blue speck on the outer rim. Earth was supposed to be a dead zone. Instead, it was a massive churning anvil waiting to forge their broken fleet into a weapon. Commander Davis choked on a lungful of acrid smoke, doubling over the primary tactical console. His stomach convulsed, bringing up nothing but bitter, acidic bile that splattered onto the grated floor. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand, smearing soot across his pale jaw. The bridge of the Ethel Guard smelled like burnt hair and melted copper. "Port thrusters are gone!" Adler shouted from the pilot's pit. The navigation officer was a mess. Half his uniform was singed away, and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his forehead was already soaking through with dark crimson. He didn't look back at Davis. He just stared at the cracked primary viewport, his hands white-knuckling the manual yoke. "We're venting atmosphere in decks 4 through 9. Life support is at 15%. It's failing, Commander." Davis closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He wanted to sleep. He wanted the relentless, vibrating hum of the dying ship to just stop. The Riven Armada had chased them across 3 sectors, chewing up the rear guard, spitting out the debris, and closing the gap with terrifying mechanical precision. The Ethel Guard was a deep space exploration vessel, a ship built for charting nebula clusters and sampling atmospheric anomalies. It wasn't meant to take a plasma broadside. "Keep us angled toward the 3rd planet," Davis rasped, his throat feeling like it was lined with crushed glass. "Just get us into the gravity well." "There's nothing there, Commander," Finch said. The chief engineer was crammed under the primary conduit, sparks raining down on his protective visor. "The archive said Sol 3 is a quarantine zone, pre-warp primitives or a dead world. We're jumping into a grave." Then we'll be a very interesting archaeological find," Davis snapped. The flash of anger felt wrong, forced, but it was the only thing keeping his legs from collapsing. Just do it. The ship groaned, a deep structural scream of metal tearing against the laws of physics as Adler forced the hyperdrive to spool up one last miserable time. The jump was violent. There was no smooth transition into slip space. It felt like being crammed into a metal drum and kicked down a flight of stairs. Davis hit the deck hard, his shoulder connecting with the edge of a holotable. Pain flared, sharp and blinding, but it was quickly drowned out by the blaring klaxons. They dropped out of the jump right above the orbital plane of Earth. Davis pulled himself up using the console for leverage. He braced for the sight of a barren, cratered wasteland or a quiet, blue marble ignorant to the horrors of the galaxy. Instead, the viewport filled with iron and fire. The planet was encased in a sprawling, chaotic lattice of orbital habitats, dry docks, and defensive platforms. It was ugly. There was no aesthetic grace to it, none of the sleek, crystalline curves of Davis's homeworld architecture. This was brutalist engineering. Thick, slate-grey armor plating, massive exhaust vents spewing trails of blue plasma, and the relentless strobing flashes of thousands of welding torches working in the void. "Or what in the hell?" Adler whispered, his hands freezing on the yoke. Before Davis could issue an order, a harsh static-lace screech ripped through their internal comms, cutting through the ship's native encryption like wet paper. "Unidentified vessel, you're venting plasma into our commercial shipping lane, and your reactor is bleeding gamma radiation. Cut your drives, or we will cut them for you." The voice was flat, bored, and spoke in a harsh, guttural dialect the translation matrix barely managed to pass. "This is Commander Davis of the—" Davis coughed, tasting iron. "Of the Ethel Guard. We are seeking asylum. Our ship is failing. We are pursued." A heavy pause settled over the comms. In the background of the audio feed, Davis could hear the rhythmic clanging of heavy machinery, and someone yelling about a miscalibrated wrench. "You look like chewed-up garbage, Ethel Guard," the voice finally returned. "Power down your weapons. We're bringing you into Bay 4. Try not to explode on the way in." The tractor beams hit them a second later, They weren't the gentle, localized gravity wells Davis was used to. They were magnetic tethers, slamming into the hull with the force of a physical blow. The ship shuddered violently as it was dragged helpless and bleeding toward the massive orbital ring. Davis stared at the viewport, his chest heaving. He had surrendered his ship. He had handed his crew over to an unknown, aggressive species. He felt a deep, twisting pit of failure in his gut. He looked down at his trembling hands, the soot, the grime. He wasn't a hero saving his crew. He was just a terrified man who had run out of space to run. The dry dock smelled intensely of ozone, cheap synthesized caffeine, and sweat. The moment the airlock cycled open, the humans swarmed the ship. There was no formal greeting, no diplomatic exchange. A squad of engineers in heavy, scuffed hazard suits stomped onto the bridge. They didn't carry clipboards or data pads. They carried heavy plasma cutters, pneumatic drills, and coils of thick black cabling. A woman with grease smeared across her forehead and a battered tool belt slung low on her hips walked right past Davis. She didn't even look at him. She walked up to the primary navigation console, kicked the base of it with a heavy steel-toed boot, and watched the holoscreen flicker and die. "Junk," she announced. Her voice was loud, raspy. "Miller, get a crew in here and rip out the neural optic relays. They're fused to hell anyway." "Wait, stop!" Davis stepped forward, his voice cracking. He tried to project authority, to stand tall, but he was bruised, exhausted, and barely holding it together. "Those relays are grown from pure silicate. They take years to calibrate. You can't just—" The woman finally turned to look at him. She had hard, pale eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a full night's sleep in a decade. A name tag on her stained coveralls read, "Sarah." "Buddy," Sarah said, pointing a grease-stained finger at his chest. "Your silicate relays are currently leaking localized microwave radiation directly into your pilot's lap. Unless you want his future children to glow in the dark, I'm ripping them out. We're replacing it with a copper-jacketed hard line. It ain't pretty, but it works." Before Davis could argue, a massive bearded human, Miller, shoved past him carrying a circular saw the size of a shield. "Watch your toes, shiny," Miller grunted, immediately driving the saw into the delicate sweeping arch of the bridge's aesthetic paneling. Sparks flew in a violent arc, illuminating the bridge in harsh stroboscopic light. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched mechanical scream that set Davis's teeth on edge. He stumbled back, coughing as a cloud of fiberglass dust filled the air. He looked for Finch, hoping his chief engineer could talk some sense into these barbarians. He found Finch in the corridor, backed against a bulkhead, watching in absolute horror as a team of humans took crowbars to the warp drive manifold. "They're breaking it," Finch whispered, his eyes wide and panicked. "Davis, they're taking an angle grinder to the harmonic stabilizer." "Hey, don't touch that," Davis yelled, rushing forward and grabbing the arm of a human engineer. The human stopped, lifting his welding mask. He looked annoyed. "You got a problem, boss?" "That is the harmonic stabilizer," Davis said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. "If you cut through the containment housing, you'll disrupt the zero-point equilibrium." The engineer stared at him for a long moment. Then he let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Zero-point equilibrium. Look at this thing." He smacked the metal housing with a heavy wrench. It gave a hollow, metallic thud. "Your stabilizer is a glorified glass cannon. You take one kinetic hit and this thing shatters, taking half the ship with it. We're ripping it out. We're putting in a localized fusion core. It's got a 10-inch lead tungsten jacket." "Fusion?" Finch gasped, clutching his chest. "That's incredibly volatile. It's primitive. It's reliable," the engineer interrupted, pulling his mask back down. "Now back up before you catch some slag in the eye." Davis stood in the corridor, useless, displaced. He watched his beautiful ship, the pride of the expeditionary fleet, being gutted. The humans worked with a terrifying, chaotic synergy. They shouted over the noise, swore constantly, and threw heavy tools across the deck. There was no reverence for the technology. To them, the ship wasn't a vessel of exploration. It was a hunk of metal that needed to be hammered into a specific shape. For 3 days, the Ethelgard remained docked. Davis didn't sleep. He paced the chaotic, sparking corridors, breathing in the smell of burning metal and industrial solvents. His hands were covered in a permanent layer of dark grease he couldn't wash off. His stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. He found himself standing in the lower engineering bay, watching Sarah weld a massive, crude-looking steel bracket onto the inner hull. "You're making it heavier," Davis said softly. It was the first time he had spoken to her without yelling. Sarah paused, flipping her mask up. She wiped sweat from her forehead with a dirty rag. "Yeah, we are." The Ethel Guard relies on speed, on agility. You're strapping tons of dense armor plating to a frame that wasn't designed for it. You'll ruin our thrust-to-mass ratio. Sarah looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction. It wasn't pity exactly, but something close to understanding. "I saw the burn marks on your outer hull, Davis. I saw the telemetry data from your flight recorders. Whatever chased you here, they aren't trying to outrun you. They're trying to punch holes in you. Speed didn't save you out there. Armor will." She tossed the rag onto a crate and leaned against the bulkhead. "We're not fixing your ship to go back to exploring nebula dust, Commander. We're fixing it so you can survive the trip out of this system." Davis looked at the heavy, dark metal encasing his once sleek engine room. It felt claustrophobic. It felt heavy. It felt like a bunker. "You don't understand," Davis said, his voice tight. "The Riven, they don't stop. They don't negotiate. They are a swarm. If they track our warp signature here, they will burn this station to ash just to get to us." Sarah pulled a small, crushed paper cylinder from her pocket, struck a match against the wall and lit it. She inhaled deeply, exhaling a cloud of grey smoke. It smelled awful, sharp and toxic. "Let them come," she said simply. "We've been bored lately." The transformation was absolute. When Davis finally stepped back onto the bridge, he didn't recognize it. The sweeping panoramic viewports had been ripped out and replaced with narrow, heavily armoured slits backed by thick layers of transparent aluminum. The elegant touch-sensitive holoconsoles were gone. In their place were bulky mechanical control stations with heavy physical switches, toggle arrays, and redundant analog dials. Everything was bolted down. Everything was reinforced. The ship didn't hum anymore. It growled. The new fusion reactor sat in the belly of the vessel like an angry beast, vibrating through the deck plates and straight up into Davis's boots. "What have you done?" he breathed, trailing a hand over a cold steel console. Miller stepped out from the shadows of the tactical alcove. He was wiping grease from his hands with an old towel. "We gave her some teeth." Davis frowned. Looking at the newly installed tactical displays, his stomach dropped. Those are hardpoint indicators. You've mounted external pods." "Yep," Miller said casually. "Ripped out your atmospheric sensor arrays. You don't need to smell the air on a gas giant right now. We put in 2 twin-linked rotary mass drivers on the port and starboard bow, firing 60-pound depleted uranium slugs at a fraction of light speed, and we hollowed out your lower cargo bay." "To put what?" Davis demanded, his voice rising, a sharp spike of panic hitting his chest. "A torpedo tube," Miller grinned. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the smile of a predator. Unshielded nuclear warheads. Dumb fire. No targeting lasers for the enemy to jam. You just point the nose of the ship at the guy you don't like, and you pull the heavy red lever. "This is a science vessel!" Davis yelled, slamming his hand against the console. The metal didn't even vibrate. "We are an exploration crew. We do not know how to fire depleted uranium slugs. We are not soldiers." "You are now, buddy," Sarah said, walking onto the bridge. She tossed a heavy canvas jacket at him. Davis caught it clumsily. It was thick, lined with ballistic weave. "Unless you want to sit in the captain's chair and throw rocks at them when they show up." "They are already here," Adler said. The pilot's voice was completely flat. Davis snapped his head toward the navigation pit. Adler was strapped into a heavy 5-point harness, his hands wrapped around a new, dual-stick steering yoke that looked like it belonged in a tractor. He was staring at the analog radar screen. "Proximity klaxons are dead. They stripped them out," Adler said, tapping a dirty glass dial. "But the long-range scanners just picked up 42 warp ruptures on the edge of the Sol system. It's the Riven. They followed the trail." The bridge went dead silent. The only sound was the deep, rhythmic thrum of the human reactor beneath their feet. Davis felt a cold sweat break out across his back. His breath hitched in his throat. 42 ships. They had barely survived 3. The air in his lungs felt thin, useless. He wanted to curl up in a corner. He wanted to surrender. He looked at Sarah and Miller, expecting to see panic, expecting to see them rush for the escape pods. Instead, Miller sighed, tossing his rag aside. He cracked his knuckles, the sound loud like snapping branches. 42. Guess I owe Henderson 20 credits. I bet 50. Sarah didn't even blink. She walked over to the tactical console, reached past Davis, and slammed a heavy, rusted switch upward. The ship responded instantly. Deep inside the hull, hydraulic loaders screamed as they began feeding massive, heavy munitions into the rotary chambers. The lights flickered, dimming to a harsh, blood-red tactical hue. A mechanical voice, heavily accented and aggressively loud, crackled over the ship's internal speakers. Warning! Weapons hot. Safety protocols disengaged. Davis stared at the humans. They weren't afraid. They were annoyed. "Are your defense fleets intercepting them?" Davis asked, his voice a frantic whisper. "Will the orbital platforms fire?" "The orbital platforms are mostly point defense and traffic control," Sarah said, sliding into the weapons officer chair. She strapped herself in, her fingers dancing over the crude mechanical targeting toggles. "Earth Command just authorized a free fire zone, but the intercept fleets are 20 minutes out. It's just us, the dry dock turrets, and whoever gets here first." "We can't fight 42 Riven cruisers!" Davis shouted, gripping the back of Sarah's chair. "It's suicide! We need to run!" "Run where, Davis?" Sarah asked, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were cold, hard flint. "Your ship couldn't outrun them before. What makes you think you can outrun them dragging 10 tons of extra armor?" "Then what do? We stand our ground," she said softly. Then she slammed her fist down on the comms button. "Control, this is the Ethel Guard. Disengage mooring clamps. Give us a push." "Copy that, Ethel Guard," the bored voice from the station replied. "Try to keep the scrap out of the shipping lanes. Good hunting." The heavy magnetic clamps released with a sound like a thunderclap. The massive dry dock automated arms gave the ship a brutal, physical shove out into the open void. Davis stumbled, falling back into the captain's chair. It wasn't the soft, ergonomic gel seat he was used to. It was a repurposed pilot's seat from a scrap hauler, bolted directly to the floor plates. It was hard, unforgiving. He looked out the reinforced viewport slits. The void was pitch black, silent, indifferent. And then, 1,000 miles out, the darkness began to tear. Brilliant, jagged purple ruptures tore through the vacuum as the Riven Armada dropped out of warp space. They were sleek biomechanical horrors, sharp angles, obsidian hulls, and glowing venomous green weapon ports. They moved like a school of predatory fish, instantly realigning their formations to lock onto the station, and right in the middle of their path was the Ethel Guard. It was no longer a graceful explorer. It looked like a flying brick, a patchwork monster of elegant alien architecture, buried under slabs of ugly, grey human steel. It looked crude. It looked mean. "Adler," Davis whispered. His voice was shaking, but beneath the terror he felt a strange foreign pulse of adrenaline. The vibration of the floor plates was seeping into his bones. "Yes, Commander?" Adler asked, his hands gripping the mechanical yoke tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Davis swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of the station's recycled air on his tongue. He looked at the 42 approaching blips on the radar. He looked at the heavy red firing lever on Sarah's console. "Take us forward," Davis said, his voice dropping into a low, ragged rasp. "Full burn on the fusion core put us right down their throats." The Ethel Guard did not glide into battle, it lurched. The fusion core roared, sending a violent, unrefined shudder through the deck plates that rattled Davis's teeth in his skull. The acceleration compensators, meticulously calibrated for the smooth hum of a zero-point drive, screamed in protest against the sheer, brute force thrust of human engineering. Davis gripped the hard armrests of his repurposed seat, the coarse fabric biting into his palms. He could smell it now, the sharp, acrid sting of ionized air mixing with the stale sweat of his own mounting panic. Out in the black, the Riven vanguard broke formation. 3 obsidian darts, sleek and terrifyingly silent, angled downward on an intercept vector. Their hulls rippled with a sickly, iridescent light as their plasma capacitors charged. Davis had seen that light before. He had watched it melt through the Ethelguard's rear shielding, vaporizing the aft botanical decks in a single, soundless flash. "They have target lock," Adler said. The navigator's voice was a tight wire, stretched to the absolute limit. His hands manipulated the crude dual sticks, fighting the heavy, sluggish response of the newly armored hull. "Brace for thermal impact." "Forget bracing," Sarah barked from the tactical station. She didn't look at the viewport. Her eyes were locked onto a flickering monochromatic green radar screen. She slammed a heavy palm against a mechanical relay box. "Miller, divert secondary coolant to the forward ablative plates. Let them cook the armor. Keep the internal temp down." Davis held his breath. The Riven ships fired. 3 beams of superheated violet plasma bridged the void, striking the Ethelguard's nose with pinpoint, agonizing precision. The sound of the impact wasn't an explosion. It was a terrifying, low-frequency hiss, like meat dropped onto a white-hot skillet. The bridge temperature spiked instantly. The air grew stifling, heavy and thick with the smell of scorched polymer and baking metal. Davis flinched, waiting for the structural groan, waiting for the explosive decompression that would suck them all into the freezing vacuum. It didn't happen. The ship bucked, the deck groaning under the thermal stress, but the forward bulkheads held. The humans hadn't used reflective energy shielding. They had simply bolted a 3-foot-thick slab of raw, high-density tungsten carbide slag onto the prow. The plasma didn't disperse. It just burned furiously into the dense metal, boiling away inches of armor but failing to penetrate the hull. "Hull integrity at 92%, Sarah called out, her fingers dancing over physical dials. She sounded bored. "Forward plating is hot, but she's holding. They're dumping their capacitors into a brick wall." Davis opened his eyes, a bead of stinging sweat rolling down his soot-stained cheek. He stared at the tactical readout. The Riven ships were pulling up, their energy profiles dipping as their weapons cycled. They were close now, too close. Less than 10 kilometers. "Sarah," Davis said, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the mechanical din of the bridge. "We are in range." Sarah grinned. It was a feral, jagged thing that didn't reach her exhausted, bloodshot eyes. She gripped the heavy red firing lever. "Hold on to your fillings, Commander." She pulled the lever backward with a loud mechanical clack. The Ethelguard violently seized. A deafening, rhythmic thud, 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 thud erupted from the lower decks, shaking dust and loose wiring from the ceiling. It felt as though giant, invisible hammers were striking the ship from the inside. The noise was absolute, a physical force that punched the air right out of Davis's lungs. He tasted blood where he bit his lip. From the external hardpoints, the twin-linked rotary mass drivers unleashed hell. There were no elegant beams of light. There was no silent lethal energy. There was only the ferocious, blinding muzzle flash of chemical propellant, spitting a solid stream of 60-pound depleted uranium slugs into the dark. The Riven didn't understand kinetic warfare. Their defensive matrices were designed to refract lasers and dissipate plasma. When the first wave of dense, heavy uranium slammed into their elegant crystalline shielding at a fraction of light speed, the shield simply shattered like cheap glass. The lead-riven ship took a concentrated burst directly to its midsection. The kinetic transfer was grotesque. The obsidian hull buckled inward, crumpling under the sheer, brutal weight of the impact, before the rear engine block ruptured. The ship didn't just explode. It tore itself apart, tumbling away in a chaotic, sparking cloud of jagged debris and venting atmosphere. "Target 1 destroyed," Sarah reported, spitting a stray hair out of her mouth. She didn't pause. She immediately rotated a heavy analog wheel, tracking the next target. Adjusting windage, Davis sat paralyzed. He was a scientist. He had spent his life cataloguing the migratory patterns of nebula-dwelling gas rays. He was currently sitting in the command chair of a butcher's block. The sheer violence of it sickened him, twisting his stomach into cold knots. But beneath the revulsion, a hot, shameful surge of adrenaline flooded his veins. They were fighting back. They were actually fighting back. "Incoming!" Adler shouted, slamming the left stick forward. The remaining 2 Riven hunters abandoned their synchronized attack pattern. The destruction of their vanguard had panicked them. They fired wildly, chaotic bursts of green plasma tearing through the space around the Ethelgard. One shot grazed the port side, shearing off a sensor array and melting a deep, glowing scar into the external plating. The ship violently tilted. Down in engineering, Finch was screaming over the comms. "The fusion core is redlining! Davis, the magnetic containment field is fluctuating. It's too much power draw." "Tell your guy to bypass the safety governors," Miller's voice roared from the lower deck, punctuated by the sharp clang of a wrench hitting pipes. "If the core stalls now, we're sitting ducks. Feed it the damn coolant directly." "It will melt the primary lines," Finch cried. "Do it, Finch," Davis ordered, the words ripping from his throat before he could second-guess them. "Do whatever the humans tell you to do." The deck leveled out as Adler wrestled the heavy yoke, fighting the ship's massive new weight. "I can't shake them. They're matching our vector, sitting right in our blind spot." "They're trying to target the main thruster bell," Sarah muttered, her hands flying over the manual targeting interface. She was frustrated, slapping the console. "I can't depress the mass drivers enough. We don't have the angle." Davis stared at the tactical display. The 2 Riven ships were tucked directly beneath the Ethelgard's aft quarter, a place the forward-facing guns couldn't reach. They were charging their main batteries. If they fired directly up the exhaust port, no amount of human slag armor would save them. The plasma would ignite the fusion core and turn them into a temporary star. "Adler," Davis said, his mind working through the crude, brutal logic he'd absorbed over the last 3 days. "Kill the primary thrusters." Adler whipped his head around, his eyes wide beneath his blood-soaked bandage. "What?" "Commander, if we lose forward momentum, we're dead." "Kill the thrusters and engage the retro burners. Now," Davis bellowed. Adler didn't hesitate. He reached out and slammed a heavy row of toggle switches downward. The main drive cut out. Instantly, the massive forward-facing retro thrusters, usually reserved for delicate orbital docking maneuvers, flared to life with an aggressive, fuel-rich roar. The sudden, violent deceleration was like hitting a physical wall. Davis was thrown hard against his harness, the straps biting brutally into his collarbones. Sarah cursed loudly as she slammed her elbow against the tactical board. The 2 Riven ships, accelerating to maintain their tight pursuit angle, suddenly found themselves flying past a target that had effectively parked in deep space. They overshot. They drifted right into the Ethelgard's forward firing arc. "Light them up," Davis roared. Sarah grinned, a feral flash of teeth in the dim red tactical lighting. She didn't even bother with the mass drivers. She reached for a glass-covered toggle switch, flipped the cover up, and pressed a heavy yellow button. Beneath them, the cargo bay doors ground open. There was no recoil. There was only a slight dull thump as the unguided, stripped-down nuclear torpedo was ejected from its pneumatic tube. It drifted forward, a heavy, ugly metal cylinder devoid of any elegant targeting telemetry. It just flew straight ahead, directly into the path of the frantically turning Riven ships. 3 seconds later, the void ignited. The proximity fuse tripped. The resulting nuclear detonation in a vacuum was a brief, blindingly white sphere of pure, unfiltered thermal radiation. Without an atmosphere to carry the shock wave, the destructive force was entirely localized heat and raw X-ray emission. The 2 Riven ships didn't stand a chance. Their hulls flashed instantly from black to incandescent white, their structural integrity melting into slag before the expanding cloud of vaporized metal swallowed them completely. The radiation alarms on the Ethelgard's bridge shrieked long and piercing. "EMP shielding held," Sarah coughed, waving away a thin wisp of smoke rising from her console. "Sensors are blind, though. Give the optics a minute to clear the flash burn." Davis slumped back in his chair, his chest heaving, his uniform soaked in cold sweat. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. They had done it. They had broken the vanguard. But the victory tasted like ash. As the external optics slowly cleared, resolving from blinding white back to the cold, indifferent black of space, the radar screen flared to life again. It wasn't empty. 39 blips remained. The rest of the Riven Armada had arrived, dropping out of slip space in a massive, sprawling crescent formation. They weren't charging blindly anymore. They were taking up tactical siege positions, their weapon ports glowing with synchronized, sickening purple light. They were preparing to glass the entire sector. "Well," Miller's voice crackled over the intercom, breathless and heavy. "That's a lot of them." Davis looked at the radar. The adrenaline was gone, leaving nothing but a hollow, crushing fatigue. He had betrayed his principles, turned his beautiful ship into a weapon of crude destruction, and it wasn't going to be enough. They were going to die here, in the cold, industrial graveyard of a human orbital ring. "Sarah," Davis whispered, staring at the approaching wall of light. "Do we have any torpedoes left?" Sarah looked down at her console. She didn't answer right away. She slowly unbuckled her harness, letting out a long, ragged exhale. She reached into her pocket, pulling out another crushed paper cylinder. She put it between her lips but didn't light it. "No, Commander," she said softly. "We're out of the big rocks." The bridge fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the erratic, grinding cough of the overworked air recyclers. Davis tasted ozone and despair. He looked at Adler, whose hands had finally fallen away from the pilot's yoke. He thought of Finch down in the dark, suffocating heat of the engine room. "I am sorry," Davis said. His voice was fragile, cracking under the immense weight of the moment. "You rebuilt us. You gave us a chance, and we brought the storm to your door." Sarah finally struck a match against the metal console, the sharp scent of sulfur cutting through the smell of burnt plastic. She lit her cigarette, took a drag, and looked at the radar screen. "Don't count us out yet, Shiny," she said, exhaling a thin stream of grey smoke. The comms console violently crackled to life. It wasn't the bored, static-laced voice of the dry dock traffic controller. This voice was heavy, distorted by heavy encryption, and carried the unmistakable cadence of absolute authority. "Unidentified vessel Ethelgard. This is Admiral Cole of the United Earth Defense Fleet. You're sitting in my firing lane. Suggest you drift to port. Immediately." Davis blinked, his exhausted mind struggling to process the words. "Drift to port?" "Adler! Port thrusters! Full burn!" Sarah yelled, leaning over the navigator's shoulder and slapping the control console. The Ethelgard violently shunted sideways, the crude retro rockets firing in an uncoordinated burst that sent them skidding clumsily out of the central engagement zone. Davis looked out the reinforced viewport. The space behind them, the empty void they had just occupied, suddenly tore open. But it wasn't the elegant purple ruptures of the Riven. It was an ugly, jagged tear in reality. It looked as though the fabric of space was being violently ripped apart by rusty claws. Massive, blocky shapes erupted from the slipspace tears. They didn't have the sleek, biomechanical grace of the Riven Armada. They were floating fortresses of iron, steel, and exposed exhaust piping. They were ugly. They were brutal. They were the human intercept fleet. There were no formation displays, no graceful synchronized maneuvers. The human ships just poured into the system like a bar brawl spilling out into an alley. They were heavily armoured dreadnoughts, bristling with railguns, rotary cannons, and missile pods. Their engines burned with a dirty, aggressive orange glare. "All vessels weapons-free," Admiral Cole's voice echoed over the open channel, calm and terrifyingly casual. "Break their teeth." What followed wasn't a battle. It was an industrial accident on a cosmic scale. Davis watched in stunned, horrified awe. The Riven Armada, disciplined and precise, unleashed a coordinated barrage of plasma fire. The violet beams struck the human fleet in a dazzling, blinding display of thermal energy, but the human ships didn't shatter. Their armor was too thick, their bulkheads too dense. They absorbed the withering fire, their hulls glowing cherry red, venting massive clouds of white-hot coolant directly into the void to keep their reactors from melting down. They just kept moving forward, an unstoppable wall of burning iron. And then the humans fired. The silence of space was meaningless against the sheer physical vibration of the kinetic barrage. Thousands of depleted uranium slugs, high-explosive armor-piercing rounds, and crude, unguided nuclear torpedoes filled the void. The human strategy lacked any tactical elegance. It was simply overwhelming, saturating violence. The riven shields, designed to deflect light and dissipate energy, were instantly overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing mass of solid matter. Ships were torn in half by railgun slugs. Formations were shattered by nuclear shockwaves. The elegant obsidian hulls crumpled and tore under the relentless hammering assault. It was a slaughter. The Riven tried to retreat, their ships attempting to spool up their warp drives to flee the sector. But the human dreadnoughts didn't let them. They fired localized gravity tethers, the same brutal magnetic harpoons that had dragged the Ethelgard into the dry dock, snagging the retreating Riven vessels and yanking them violently backward, right into the teeth of the rotary cannons. Within 20 minutes, the space above Earth was a graveyard. The 42 ships of the Riven Vanguard, the terror of 3 sectors, had been reduced to a sprawling field of shredded obsidian, venting atmosphere and frozen coolant. The human fleet didn't celebrate. There were no victorious cheers over the comms. They simply began dispatching heavy, blocky tug ships, deploying massive salvage claws to drag the Riven wreckage back toward the orbital dry docks. To the humans, it wasn't just a victory. It was raw material. Davis sat in his hard, uncomfortable chair, his hands resting on his grease-stained knees. The Ethelgard was quiet now, save for the rhythmic, steady thump of the human fusion core beneath his boots. The ship smelled of sweat, smoke, and cheap tobacco. It was ruined. It would never chart a nebula again. It would never be the pristine jewel of the exploration fleet. He looked at Sarah. She was leaning against the tactical console, watching the salvage operation through the narrow viewport slits. She looked tired, her face smudged with soot and grease. "You destroyed them," Davis whispered, his voice hoarse. "You didn't just defeat them, you tore them apart." Sarah glanced at him, her hard, pale eyes catching the dim light of the primary console. She didn't smile. "We told you, Davis. Out here, speed doesn't save you, armor does. And when something comes to your house looking for a fight, you don't ask it to leave." She walked over, clapping a heavy, grease-stained hand onto his shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. "You did good, Commander," she said quietly. "You held the line." Davis looked down at his own hands. They were no longer the soft, clean hands of a scientist. They were blistered, bruised, and permanently stained with the dark, heavy grease of human engineering. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had survived the fire, but he had been forged into something else entirely. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt heavy. He felt armored. He looked back out at the sprawling, ugly, beautiful mess of the human orbital ring. The forge was still burning. The hammers were still falling. "Adler," Davis said, his voice finding a new, rougher resonance in his chest. "Take us back to Bay 4. We have structural damage to repair." He paused, running a hand over the cold, thick steel of his command console. "And ask Miller if they have any more of those nuclear warheads. I think we're going to need a bigger magazine. If you enjoyed this descent into the gritty, industrial heart of human survival, hit that like button to keep the fusion cores burning. Share this with your fellow sci-fi lovers who know that sometimes raw kinetic firepower beats elegant lasers every single time. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY Tactical Deep Dive. Let me know in the comments. Would you trust human engineering to save your ship? See you in the void.